Perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Abhishek Sen, and I've got my teammate Forrest Estes on the call with me. And today we're giving our group presentation for fundamentals of oral communication. For this presentation, we're going to talk more about group communication in particular. Specifically, we're going to dive into communication failure, and we're going to talk about examples when group communication doesn't always work out effectively or as successfully as all parties would have wanted to play out. Force is going to speak on a case of groupthink by the medical technology company Theranos. And after that, I'm going to speak on the 2010 BP oil spill. In both these cases, one commonality is that group communication failure almost always affects not only the parties communicating, but also a wide range of other groups who weren't even in the process. So we just want to emphasize that effect. And now we'll hear
Absolutely.
from the Forest.
All right. Thank you very much. So when discussing Theranos, I feel it's important to give a quick summary of its very beginning. Theranos was founded by Elizabeth Holmes, who was studying at Stanford between 2003 and 2004, where she worked in a lab dealing with the original SARS outbreak. And she became exposed to a technology known as lab-on-a-chip technology, which would be a single board that could do a variety of blood tests, and this technology enamored her. But notably, even from the beginning, her professor, Phyllis Gardner, made it clear that she did not believe that the technology would ever work. But with a very good sales pitch, she had managed to gain $6 million in investments by the end of 2004. Although a notable thing, most medical companies, other companies in the space would not take her up on her pitch, as in reality, she only knew enough about the technology to make a good pitch, not enough to truly sell people who are knowledgeable. But anyway, as we move forward into development, very early on, the engineers that she had hired and that she was contracting make it very clear that the TheraPatch technology, which was the original hope, which would have been about the size of a large Band-Aid, would have been able to go onto the arm, and it would have been able to do blood tests without a visible needle. Very early on, the engineers made it very clear that that was not going to be a feasible idea. This is one of the only cases within this entire story in which Holmes was actually quite reasonable with her engineers. So, seeing that the TheraPatch was not possible, they pivoted and created something called the Theranos 1.0, which is about the size of a Macintosh computer. Now, this machine would have taken a little bit more blood, but it would have been able to do more tests, and it would have been able to do them reasonably. That is, if it ever worked. See, the problem with the Theranos 1.0 is that it never functioned. But engineers were heavily pressured by Elizabeth Holmes to lie about the performance of the Theranos 1.0, specifically for a conference with the medical company Novartis, in which they took blood samples and then regurgitated pre-baked answers in efforts to lie to investors in order to gain more funding. And Holmes assured people that while this was not good, it was a one-time occurrence, and they needed the money in order to further the project and make the real thing. But as you'll quickly see, this pattern of behavior continues pretty much until the company is closed down after litigation. For 15 months, or they gained the contract for a 15-month study with Pfizer, in which they would be tracking the results of cancer patients responding to medication using Theranos machines. But very quickly, it became clear to Pfizer that the results that they were receiving from Theranos were tampered with. And again, Elizabeth Holmes is overselling the ability of her machines and pressuring her employees to lie to investors and people that they were working for in hopes that they can secure yet more funding. So eventually, they create a new machine in which the lab environment just breaks down. Engineers are being made to put their hands into broken machines containing potassium cyanide. The machines called the Edison, the machine that they make, is not even capable of doing not even a quarter of the tests that it is advertised as being capable of. It was able to do about 50 very basic blood tests, and they promised about 220. Then finally, we get our first whistleblower, this being Tyler Schultz. He comes forth with with the information from before, that being the Edison never functioned. It never was meeting safety checks. And notably, that the work environment within Theranos was truly awful. He described that there were blockades and checkpoints within the facilities so that people were controlled where they went, and that entire portions of Theranos facilities were completely locked down to even the employees. He also described how there was a list of banned words that you were not allowed to use when describing your job to people around you for legal reasons, because in the event that Theranos was ever found out to be a complete fraud, it would help to protect them from false advertising. The next whistleblower was Erica Chung, who talks about how the machines were not being calibrated, and at any point when they were calibrated, it would take over 14 straight hours of work in which employees were made to sleep in their cars, as they were not allowed to leave during the calibration process. She also described how she would place error reports next to the machines so that they could be, worked on, and then managers would take them away and throw them away. And she specifically recalls a time when a manager came to her and said, "Don't speak up. Speaking up will put you on their radar. You don't want to be on their radar." And in truth, it really did seem that you did not want to be on their radar, as other employees attested to the fact that Holmes was constantly holding the threat of termination over people's heads. And if she did not immediately terminate you for raising basically any concern with anything that the company was doing, she would completely ostracize you within the company and would move you over to completely unimportant projects, basically banning you from working on any of the projects that mattered. And in fact, this created such a hostile work environment, and their turnover rate was so high that at one point a notable case was that a lab director was replaced with a pediatric dermatologist because they had moved through all of the credible people in the city and were just taking anybody they could get. And this man had to Google Theranos technologies so that he could try to do the job. Now, on the topic of lab directors, there was also a notable thing in that branches of the company were seemingly disallowed from communicating between each other. All communication had to go directly to Elizabeth Holmes and her co-owner, Sunny Balshwani. It had to go straight to them, and then they would go to everybody else. And you can understand that it's quite difficult to make a blood testing machine when your chemistry department and your engineering department aren't allowed to talk to each other. In fact, this problem was so bad that eventually, slight spoiler alert, they eventually are taken to court for fraud. And during the proceedings of that, two people come forward claiming to be the lab director of one lab. And it turns out they are both the director of the lab. There was a lab running with two directors who were completely unaware of each other's existence because communication had been throttled down that much. Now, eventually, whistleblowers congregate and they bring together enough employees and current employees and ex-employees that they are able to launch a massive suit against Theranos, and they end up suing them for $700 million in fraud, where Elizabeth Holmes eventually faces 20 years in prison and $2,500,000 in fines. Now, this case was terrible for the people within the company because Theranos became very, very big for a while. It was valued at a $10 billion company. So if you got fired from Theranos, you would have a very hard time finding a job anywhere in the industry after that. But it also really harmed people because during those proceedings, they ended up admitting that over 2 years of blood tests that Theranos had been doing were completely void. The data was falsified or the data was inaccurate. So for 2 years, people were taking blood tests from Theranos that were simply false, and they were getting medical treatment based on these diagnoses. So not only was, the medical world deprived of technology they were promised, but people were falsely advertised to in the worst way possible, in that they were falsely advertised a solution for their health problems, which is truly just to show how, even if it might seem like just a company is burning down, in truth, you can see that it'll affects the customer base, and it can even affect, people surrounding them. But it would be remiss of me to say that Theranos' decline has quite the amount of impact that the BP oil spill of 2010 did. So I believe if we pivot over back to Abhishek, we can truly see what happens when communication breaks down in a big way.
Yep. Thank you, Forrest. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen so I can show my presentation. Can you see my screen right now?
Absolutely.
Sounds good. Okay, so obviously I'm speaking on the 2010 BP oil spill communication failure. And if this picture doesn't tell you already, this was a huge disaster in both the oil industry and for the hundreds of people affected by it. Okay, so to talk about what happened, in April 10, BP's Deepwater Horizon oil rig in Louisiana, so in the United States, exploded in a massive blowout. 11 people died and 17 others were injured in the process. This happened when BP was drilling into the Macondo well. It was an exploratory well, so they're just looking for new possibilities. This is in the Gulf of Mexico, and this was through the Deepwater Horizon rig. 2 days after the incident, the burning rig sank, as if we didn't have enough problems then. And this is the largest offshore oil spill in the United States history. BP showed poor communication throughout this incident, both leading up and after it took place. And this catastrophe could have very well been avoided if all the groups involved communicated better and more effectively. So to talk about the communication failures that caused this, BP was working on this project with two other companies, Halliburton Co. and Transocean Limited. And in an independent review conducted, all three of these companies were deemed responsible for maintaining poor communication amongst each other. They failed to share important information and findings, and they didn't fully understand the risks taken when going into this exploratory well through Deepwater Horizon. The companies showed poor management of the oil rig in the first place, and they never really communicated how tasks would be delegated. Further, BP didn't communicate their cost-cutting measures and didn't analyze the risks that came along with it. Obviously, for a huge business like this, in such an expensive project, BP wanted to cut down on their expenses, and doing so brought about risks that simply weren't communicated. After the spill, in response to a crisis, it's always important to show strong leadership and build confidence among those affected to, one, show empathy for everyone affected, and two, restore the company's reputation as much as you can at this point. BP didn't show any such leadership, and they communicated very little and not effectively at all to the public. They were slow to calculate and communicate the extent of this crisis. Their crisis spokesperson was the CEO at the time, Tony Hayward, and he made several gaffes and implausible denials about the situation. For example, at one point, when he was being pressured by the media for a comment, he mentioned, "I want my life back," as if this is just a minor event that put a small dent in his life, let alone the 11 people and their families who were affected by the incident. So now, how could communication have been better? And how could this incident be avoided? So before the incident, the three companies, BP, Halliburton, and Transocean, they should have communicated how to delegate management responsibilities and tasks, just to establish who's managing what area of the project, who's leading what task, and how they can move forward. They should have regular check-in meetings to discuss updates, changes in the process, and the risks that came along with it. For example, in this type of check-in meeting, BP would have revealed their cost-cutting measures, analyze the risks, and the three companies, now with better understanding of the risks, could have taken a more educated decision as to whether to continue the project or not, or continue with the cost-cutting measures or not. That kind of goes into my third point. They should have communicated these measures earlier, taken risk analysis both among the three companies and from external third parties before putting these measures into effect. After the incident, BP still could have done a lot more after the incident in their best interest of protecting their reputation, as well as to show support and empathy for those involved. BP should have been quick to come out with a public statement, both informing everyone of both the cause and extent of these damages, both from a business point of view and from a humanitarian point of view, as to who all were affected. They should have communicated and given sufficient updates on the investigation on a timely basis as the updates were coming in. And they should have, decided on preventive measures to take in the future, and to communicate these measures to restore faith and support in the company. And any spokesperson for the company should have been very careful and cautious with whatever public remarks they made, since the whole company came into light after this event. And they should have avoided making inconsiderate statements given the circumstances, like Hayward did. Seeing that 11 people died and so many families were affected, it definitely wasn't the best time to say, I just want my life back. That brings me to the end of my segment. Forrest, if you want to finish things off.
Absolutely. So I think at the end of the day, this all comes together to show you that communication is as overstated as the statement is. Communication is key. And when you are attempting to hold proper communication within a small group or within a company, you owe it not only to the people within your company to, move through communication properly and be a good, proper group leader, but you also owe it to anybody who your company would affect or touch. You owe it to your consumer, you owe it to the workers on your plant, you owe it to the people living on the shore of where you're drilling. It just shows that at the end of the day, we have the ability to reach so many people than we think we do, both in the positive and in the negative. And that's why cases of extreme communication breakdown like this really do show the utmost importance that's proper communication.